Good morning, and welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church in Reston. I'm Mark Sheppard, a member of this church's governing board. Whether you are with us on Zoom or here with us in the sanctuary today, we are glad you chose to join us this morning. No matter how old or how young you are, wherever you are on your spiritual journey, however you identify and whomever you love, know that you are welcome here. Our service today is being led by Reverend Scott Alexander. We're also glad to have back in the sanctuary our music director, Cynthia Young. Welcome back. She's accompanied today by UUCR member Phillip Kancianic. Phillip also planned today's music, so thank you twice today. Linda Weaver, our Director of Religious Education, is downstairs with the children. There is no time for all ages today. Children are invited downstairs for activities in childcare. We've got one change from your order of service to our cast. The role of Worship Associate Steve Ewart will be played by Worship Associate Bob Anthony. You can all judge how well he plays the role of Worship Associate Steve Ewart at the end of today's service. Thanks to all of you for participating in today's worship service. And thanks, as always, to our rotating production team, consisting of Amelia Turner, Mike Schmitt, David Niemi, and Maggie Mack. For those of you in the sanctuary, now is the time to turn off your rectangular attention vampire. If you're joining us on Zoom, please do not turn off your rectangular attention vampire. Please stay with us for the duration of the service. At this time, let us center ourselves for worship. Please join me in some deep, quieting breaths as we enter into our time of worship together by listening to Pink by Starer, performed by Phillip Kancianic.
Well, good summer morning to you. I'm so pleased to have, a full summer house this morning here in Present, and those of you online filling out the experience. I would remind you that you do not need to register to come to church these days. Just come. We have a wonderful service every Sunday morning. Our opening words are from my colleague Marianne Cotter. Welcome to this place of promise, purpose, and possibility. For this is love's hearth, the home of hope, a refuge for minds in search of truth unfolding, ever beautiful, ever strange. Here, compassion is our shelter, freedom, our protection from the storms of bigotry and hate. In this place may we find comfort and courage. Here, may our sight become vision to see the unseen and to glimpse the good that is yet to be. Where is our holy church?
Morning. Our opening hymn today is number 113, Where is our holy church? If you are at home on Zoom, the words will be in your chat box. And those of you here in the sanctuary, please rise in body or spirit as you are willing or able and join us in singing. Where is our holy church? Where we stand class unite as equal persons in the search for beauty, truth, and right. Where is our holy writ? Where are our human heart? A sacred torch of truth has lit by inspiration taught. Where is our Holy One? Almighty host respond. The people rise in every land to break the captive's bond. Where is our holy land? Within the human soul, wherever free minds truly seek with character the goal. Where is our paradise? In aspiration's sight, wherein we hope to see arise 10,000 years of light.
This morning's chalice lighting words are by Pat Uribe Lishi. Our chalice is a reminder that in hard times, our ancestors in faith acted with courage to bring hope and safety, to bring life itself, to threaten people. We light it today as a reminder of who we are called to be in a world still dangerous and despairing. With courage and faith, we bring ourselves to the work before us.
In our church, it is our tradition to recommit to each other every Sunday by singing a covenant together. Love is the spirit of this church. It has been noted that in past years, this used to be sung more reflectively, sitting down. So let's try that this week and see how we like it. So let's remain seated as we sing our covenant. If you're at home, the words will be in your chat box.
Now is the time in our service when we share our joys and concerns with one another so that no one ever has to hold them alone. If you are joining us remotely this morning from home, you may wish to light a real or virtual candle wherever you are to mark what is on your heart as members of the present congregation come forward to place stones in the water which holds so much of our love to acknowledge what is on their heart. And as those come forward, if you wish to take a stone from around the bowl to take home with you to remind you what's on your heart this morning during the week, please do so. And those of you at home, if you wish to share your joy or concern in the chat, please do so, but remember that what you write there does become public. And now let us all contemplate one another's joys and sorrows as we listen to Phillip play our meditation music. Let us be one in spirit and affection. Spirit of life and love that so faithfully animates our creation, we are grateful for this hour of togetherness and for this community that stays with us in both times of joy and sorrow. We hold all in our hearts this morning around our globe who are facing hardship and difficulty, those who are grieving, facing loss or illness, disability amongst themselves or others, whether that be near or far. In particular, this morning, I hold in my thoughts my friend Len Bowen, who lost his husband this week. Whether shared here this morning or held silently in our hearts, may our joys be multiplied in community, and may all gathered here this hour find comfort and calm. Amen.
As a self-funded church, UCR relies on the generosity of its members and friends to fund daily operations and to ensure that the church and its resources are here for us and for others, now and in the future. Pledges support our worship and music programs, our religious education program, programs for members and friends, community outreach, and connections to Unitarian Universalism. We now invite you to support the work of UU Reston by making your donation to the collection plate if you are here in the sanctuary, or at the link on the slide and in the chat box if you are with us online. Thank you for your generous support of our beloved spiritual home.
Thank you, Phillip. Gotta love show tunes. Played well. To get us started on this morning's topic of when religion gets dangerous, I want to introduce you to two Unitarian Universalist heroes you may have never heard of. The first is Greg McKendry of Knoxville, Tennessee. Do we have his picture? I guess not. Okay. Here is an excerpt. I'll show you his picture. There he is. Okay, great. Here's an excerpt from an article from the news website BuzzFlash, written back in the summer of 2008 about him and his tragic but heroic death. When a crazed killer walked into the Tennessee Valley UU Church last week, he first had to contend with Usher Greg McKendry. McKendry, a 60-year-old man described by fellow church members as a very large gentleman, a, quote, refrigerator, and looking, quote, like a football player, he used his size to block the shotgun blast being fired at the children on the stage performing Annie. His compassion loomed large, too. His 16-year-old foster son, Tyler, told the Knoxville News Sentinel that McHenry got in the way of the gunman to save the children who were performing that Sunday. McKendry and his wife, Barbara, were quite active in the church. They served on committees, purchased much-needed equipment, and taught a family finance class for the church. The McKendrys also took up progressive causes in their community in an effort to distribute President Bush's most recent stimulus package in a way he thought would be most equitable. McKendry called on wealthier church members who felt they did not need the extra money to donate their $600 rebate check to the church. Fellow church member Donna Creech was quoted by the Knoxville News Sentinel describing his commitment to environmentalism. Quote, he was instrumental in making changes to our church to become more environmentally friendly, making us better stewards of the environment. It is hard to believe, the article goes on, that someone would be moved to murder people for embracing and living out such ideals. But it seems McKendry's commitment to progressive causes, combined with his desire to protect vulnerable people, indeed led to his untimely end. Jim David Atkinson, the man charged with the murders at the Tennessee Valley UU Church, reportedly carried out the bloodshed because of his hatred of liberals. For standing up for these values and protecting human life with his own, we salute, BuzzFeed writes, McKendry by giving him this week's Wing of Justice Award. His family and friends are in our thoughts. We know that an award cannot bring him back and probably does little or nothing to assuage the pain of those who miss him, but we want them to know that Greg McKendry inspired us deeply and won't be forgotten. And my second Unitarian hero is Wendy Winters, a UU hero from our own area. When we list personal virtues we hope Unitarian Universalists will exemplify in their lives, we seldom think to include physical courage, but we should. 3 years ago, on June 29th, 2019, as many of you will remember, an angry and disgruntled citizen of Annapolis, Maryland, burst into the newsroom of the Capital Gazette newspaper and started shooting, trying to kill all the writers and editors there. Staff writer Wendy Winters, an active member of our Annapolis congregation, had just been through an active shooter training and did not dive under her desk as most of her colleagues did, but chose the other response advocated in that training, to fight back. She grabbed a trash can and recycling bin she kept by her desk and charged toward the assailant, yelling at him to stop, distracting him long enough for most of the writers and editors in the room to escape with their lives. 6 survived. She died. and she is now remembered as a hero who saved the lives of her colleagues. Quote, "In an act of extraordinary courage, she gave her heart, and she gave her last breath, and she gave her final 8 pints of blood. Over the last 20 years, Wendy had been a regular volunteer blood donor, donating more than 11 gallons of blood for the Red Cross for her neighbors and friends. Quote, giving to the defense of a free press and in the defense of her family at the Capital Gazette," said Winters' son, Phoenix, to a crowd of more than 700 who gathered for her memorial service at our church in Annapolis. The Washington Post reports that Wendy was an exemplar citizen, writing some 275 to 350 feature articles a year about how to improve life in Annapolis, Maryland. Quote, this is the Post, "When she wasn't reporting on her neighbors, Winters was trying to help them, advising their daughters as a Girl Scout troop leader, haranguing them to donate blood in her role as an organizer for the Red Cross." And again, she gave tons of blood. And contacting legislators on a wide variety of issues. She kept local representatives, the Post said, on speed dial. Wendy Winters was a UU hero of whom we can be rightly proud. May her final act of physical courage and connection with her co-workers and community inspire us, perhaps, to risk our lives for the principles of our faith, should we ever face such a moment to stand and fight for what we believe in. So now to my sermon, when religion gets dangerous. My question this morning, which trust me, weighs most heavily on my heart right now as what I believe to be an ominous juncture in American life, is simply, when does religion truly get dangerous? I think the answer is as obvious as it is sobering. And next slide, please. Religion gets dangerous whenever the core beliefs and affirmations of our faith are endangered and violated by the powers and principalities of the culture in which we live. And we as a people of faith feel compelled to stand up to those powers and principalities and resist. So in a word, religion gets dangerous when we are called by the dictates of conscience and courage to stand up and fight for what our religion tells us is morally right and true in the face of the dangerous powers and principalities that try to convince us otherwise. As I pray you all understand right now, we are in dangerous times, perhaps becoming incredibly dangerous. Dangerous for serious religious people when they take the risk of defending what they know in their heart of hearts and minds to be good and loving and true. Let me quickly tell you about 3 additional heroes of our faith from our history who did just that. The first is the Reverend Nobert Chap. He was the charismatic minister of the Unitarian Church in Prague, Czechoslovakia, as the storm clouds of World War II gathered over Europe. The congregation he had founded, which gathered by the thousands in Prague every Sunday in a large medieval palace, grew to be the largest Unitarian congregation in the world, probably the largest Unitarian congregation ever. And this church was known all over Czechoslovakia as a progressive spiritual place where people of different ethnic backgrounds and even different religions and beliefs could come together as Chapek wanted it, in brotherhood, unity, and peace. When World War II broke out and Hitler's occupying armies marched into Czechoslovakia and seized that country, Chapek, who was vigorously opposed to fascism, was invited by the American Unitarian Association to escape to safety in Boston. But Reverend Chapek chose to remain in Europe to do what he could to resist Hitler and the Third Reich. The Unitarians in Prague, under Dr. Čapek's moral leadership, resisted Nazism and were involved in an underground movement there which sought to rescue as many Jews and others who were being arrested by the German authorities. In the spring of 41, Nobert and his daughter were arrested by the Gestapo, who confiscated and burned all of his sermons and books and tried to dissolve the congregation. After being held in a notorious Czech prison in 42, he was transported to the forced labor camp, quote unquote, of Dachau, where he was tortured and eventually gassed. When news of his death reached the United States, Frederick May Elliott, the president of the American Unitarian Association, wrote, "Another name is added to the list of heroic Unitarian martyrs by whose death our freedom has been bought. Ours is now the responsibility to see that we stand fast in the liberty so gloriously won." For Dr. Čapek, religion got dangerous when, in the face of Hitler and Hitler's evil, he stood up to defend the humanity-loving principles of his faith. The second hero, the Reverend A. Powell Davies, was arguably the most famous Unitarian minister. Did anyone here know him personally? Yeah, and I knew his widow, who lived to be 104. She was a member of our River Road congregation, Muriel. What an amazing person. Born of Welsh parents in England, he emigrated to the United States in 1928, and after a pastorate in Summit, New Jersey, became the senior minister of All Souls Unitarian Church down on 16th Street, just up from the White House, which he served from 44 until his premature death at his desk in 1957. Citing him as one of America's most outstanding clergy persons, Time magazine in the early 50s said that in the nation's capital, quote, "Where many talk but few listen, Davies is a man who is heard." And the Washington Post described him as, quote, militantly in the forefront of every assault upon intolerance, racial discrimination, and injustice. After the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the summer of 45, Davies, deeply concerned about the dangers that atomic weapons posed for the human future, and wary of the virtually unchecked power of the American military establishment, he led the charge to make sure that there would be civilian, not military, control over nuclear technology in the United States. Here is an unbelievably troubling photograph from that time of U.S. military officials. Do we have that next slide? Cutting a cake shaped like a nuclear bomb explosion. Davies was right to demand that nuclear technology be controlled by civilians and not by hotheads like General Curtis LeMay, who, after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, continued to advocate for the use of nuclear weapons, both in the Korean War and in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Davies also stood up when most of the nation's clergy were noticeably silent for fear of being labeled soft on communism. He stood up to Senator Joseph McCarthy and his abusive investigations of others. In fiery sermon after fiery sermon, often published word for word by the Washington Post on Monday morning. Don't I wish I could get that coverage? Davies, in one of his sermons that was published, said, "I have been against communism my whole life, but I have also criticized the untruths and injustice of Senator McCarthy and his hearings. And I am what is called a controversial person, that is, one who does not keep quiet in the presence of evil." And Davies was also a fierce and fearless advocate for racial equality and civil and human rights in what was then a deeply still segregated Washington, D.C. Under his moral leadership, African Americans were welcomed into full membership, of course, in All Souls congregation. It is still one of our few racially integrated, really truly racially complex congregations. And it was the first biracial congregation in the nation's capital. And he subsequently launched a successful citywide campaign. Most of the restaurants in Washington would not allow blacks to eat there. He published a list of every restaurant in Washington that would serve both blacks and whites. They distributed it to all of the progressive churches, and he refused to go to any restaurant, and other religion leaders in town refused to go to any restaurant that would not serve African Americans. Within weeks, every restaurant desegregated because it was hitting their pocketbooks. He desegregated. Then there was a boys' club, a police boys' club in the church, and the police would not desegregate that club. He threw them out and welcomed a biracial club into All Souls. He was a leading advocate for racial justice. Ignoring his doctor's advice to slow down and restrict his activity because of some health issues, he died working at his desk of a thrombosis in his leg in 1957 at the age of only 55. But his legacy is one, and all of these congregations, all 28 congregations in the Washington area, were largely settled by him sending forth this message of our duty to be vibrantly progressive in everything that we do, and in defense of the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The third hero and last hero I want to talk about this morning is the Reverend James Reeve, who also had a connection to All Souls. He took his faith seriously. After beginning his ministerial career as a Presbyterian, as a hospital chaplain in Philadelphia working with drug addicts, his theology became Unitarian, more inclusive and expansive, and he served the All Souls Church in Washington as associate minister before moving to Boston to work with a Quaker nonprofit providing housing for the poor. In '65, Reeve, along with hundreds of other Unitarian and Universalist ministers, answered Dr. Martin Luther King's call to go to Selma, and a higher percentage of our ministers went to Selma by far than any other religious denomination that was predominantly white. The second night, after a march to the Edmund Pettus Bridge, after sharing a simple dinner with two other ministers, Reeve was brutally attacked by a group of white men, one who bludgeoned Reeve with a baseball bat. 38-year-old father of four fell into a coma and died 2 days later. The three men charged with the assault were, of course, acquitted by an all-white jury after just 95 minutes of deliberation. Dr. King preached Reverend Reeve's eulogy at his service, and 4 hours later, President Lyndon Baines Johnson mentioned Reeve's death and the violence in Selma when he addressed Congress to introduce the Voting Rights Act, which was quickly signed into law. And Johnson, the president, said, "Many were brutally assaulted, and one good man, a man of God, was killed. Reeve gave his life in Selma so that the civil and human rights of others could be ensured." So why, on this quiet, gentle, still, no thunderstorms yet, July Sunday, am I sharing these stories, some of which are hard to listen to, about courageous Unitarian Universalists standing up with both physical and moral courage, again, to the dark powers and principalities of their times? Chap standing up to Hitler, A. Paul Davies to Joseph McCarthy and racism, and James Reeve standing up in Selma. Why am I sharing these stories at this particular moment in American history? I think you all know precisely why. No matter where you may fall along the conservative, liberal political continuum, no matter what party you affiliate with, I believe that anyone who is paying even the least moral attention to what is happening in our culture and our politics at this time understands that these are truly perilous times for our nation and our culture. Perilous not only for the future of our noble American republic and its time-honored democratic institutions and humane ideals, but also perilous for the social and moral principles that undergird our faith, Unitarian Universalism. If you had told me just a few years ago that today I would be standing before you here in Reston, Virginia, literally sick with fear for the moral and political future of my nation, I would not have believed you. For most of my adult life, optimistically and perhaps conveniently, I have believed that both American democracy and the basic goodness and humanity and compassion of our culture were strong and safe and secure despite the noise on the edges. But now, as we all fully and regrettably understand, America, it was bad before. We just didn't really realize it. So how many terrible and dangerous and divisive things have happened over the last few years, especially in the life of this nation we love, that all Unitarian Universalists and others of faith, of goodwill and severe faith and sincere faith, must now be deeply fearful about the shape and substance of the American future. And let me be very clear about this. I believe the most serious threats right now to our American life, way of life, have nothing, absolutely nothing to do with the traditional conservative liberal divide. It runs deeper than that. The current assault on bedrock American democratic norms and humane institutions has nothing to do with whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, and everything to do, however, with whether or not you are committed to the foundational values and ideals expressed in the Constitution of the United States and at the heart of this nation. And we as UUs living in these chaotic and hateful and unparalleled times must, of course, be gravely concerned. I know you're all worried. I know there's not a person here who is not worried about our future. And almost everything we cherish and affirm as Unitarian Universalists is gravely endangered in this hour. And many Americans are seemingly asleep or numb or dumb to the depth and breadth of these dangers, numb or dumb to the dangers. Now, God knows I fervently hope that history will prove that my worst fears for the future of this nation prove excessive and unwarranted. Maybe some of the bad things I fear are coming won't come. Life is sometimes like that. But right now, as one informed and I think concerned citizen, I fear that our nation may be sliding toward political tyranny and hateful divisiveness and moral darkness and political tyranny that the founders of our nation sought to prevent through the establishment of enduring checks and balances across a variety of interconnected democratic institutions. But there have been so many sinister events over recent years, many of them emanating from the highest halls of power in Washington and supported by an angry and vocal minority of Americans that have persuaded me that our American democracy and its noble dreams that ours would be an inclusive and compassionate nation for all, they are more fragile, I fear, than I ever imagined. In particular, many of the democratic institutions and inclusive traditions that have stitched America together as a nation, including full, free, and fair elections, the preservation of a whole host of personal freedoms and choices, the dream of creating a truly diverse and inclusive society built on the beauty of immigration, are under direct attack. Again, at this divisive juncture in American history, I believe that both the foundational principles of our republic and the foundational principles of our Unitarian Universalist faith are endangered. And I further believe, and dear God, I wish it were not so, I do believe that soon, perhaps very soon, as committed Americans and as a people of faith, we will be called upon, perhaps again and again and again, to stand up in the public square and to courageously resist certain powers and principalities that threaten to drag our nation down a sinister and immoral path. How could this be otherwise? These will be dangerous times for all of us who dare to speak our deepest principles. And again, let me return to what I said at the very beginning of the sermon. Religion gets dangerous whenever the core beliefs and affirmations of our faith are endangered or violated by the powers and principalities of the culture in which we live, and we as a people of faith feel compelled to stand up and resist. And just look at our 7 principles, just briefly again. Our 7 principles all point to the seriousness of this time and the depth and the commitment of the work that we must do. Our 7 Unitarian principles. Do we have that slide? There they are. And there's an 8th principle, which apparently we are moving toward adopting, and that being that in addition to all the 7 historic principles, we're working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by dismantling racism and other oppressions in ourselves and other institutions. If we take these principles seriously, most especially the first, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which frames our entire response to creation and to one another, if we take these seriously, we are going to be obliged to resist with every fiber of our being these dark powers and principalities that seem to be operating in our culture. Let me, by way of example, remind you of how several recent decisions by a handful of activist judges on the Supreme Court who suddenly find themselves in the majority, these conservatives, the endangering now the dignity, rights, and freedoms of countless persons. You all know the recent decisions to overturn the long-standing reproductive right ensured by Roe v. Wade. They also voted to prevent the Environmental Protection Agency from regulating deadly carbon monoxide from emissions from U.S. power plants. And they recently voted to disallow states to legislate sane and reasonable gun controls. They also further knocked down the wise wall separating church from state with this silly ruling about this coach in Washington who is praying in midfield right after the games. And they also have voted to allow virtual partisan political gerrymandering and voting suppression by state legislatures, and there's more to come, I'm afraid, on that sad front. All of these threaten our core principles. And what I fear, again, given the momentum of the dark and sinister impulses and the irrational policies that are trying to take hold in America, what I fear is that there may be many more times coming soon, terribly soon, when we as a people of faith and other Americans of goodwill will need to stand up and stand up boldly in the public square and say no to these unequivocally sinister powers. And let me stop right here and make what I believe is a crucial observation. These days, many well-meaning Unitarian Universalists, including some members of this congregation, are saying to me and others that these increasingly divisive times require us to work harder and harder as inclusive and caring people to find some sort of comfortable middle ground with those who fundamentally disagree with us on these crucial issues facing America. While I wholeheartedly agree that as UUs, we must always diligently seek rational conversation, two-way conversation, reasonable compromise, and sincere cooperation with those who see the world far differently than we do. In the same breath, I also believe that sometimes, many times, the moral and human stakes are so high and so severe that we simply must go to battle, to go to war with those, as in the Charlottesville white supremacists and those who stormed the Capitol. There is no reasonable compromise with those who seek to tear down our government. There is no reasonable way to engage in conversation about ways in which they might be right. They are simply wrong. One stark example is the whole momentum of what is called white supremacy. When it comes to the sinister, racist, violent ideology, there can be no compromise, no nuanced conversations, no toleration of it in any manifestation. The only moral option for us is to go to war against white supremacy and all those who advocate it. Religious people have no choice but to stand up to such evil and say no. No. All right. As I've already expressed, I have the fear that many Unitarian Universalists in general may not find all the courage and all the clarity they need to resist the forces of evil that are operating so freely in our culture and world. And this fear is compounded by another fear I have, a much more personal fear about myself. I fear that if America actually does start to spiral ever more dangerously toward tyranny and total irrationality and inhumanity, I fear that as one UU, I personally might not prove to have all the public and personal courage that I might need, that Chap showed, that A. Paul Davies showed, that James Reeve showed. I wonder if Scott Wells Alexander, as a faithful UU and minister, will find the courage to actively resist the powers and principalities that may destroy everything that I treasure. I am self-aware enough to know that it is all too easy for any of us who, by and large, comfortably benefit from the status quo and the comfort of American life, from a place, for most of us, of privilege. It is easy for us to remain silent in the face of some of my culture's most glaring moral failures, for I do benefit from the basic structure of this society. I can only pray that I, and dare I say all of you, will find the strength we need in the days ahead to speak up and resist if things really get bad. Honestly, one reason I am addressing this troubling topic this morning is to remind myself, the preacher usually preaches to himself first, that the highest obligation of my faith is that I will, when pushed, publicly stand up for what I believe, even when it comes at personal cost and at personal risk, including financial risk and personal security. In closing, as I said a bit earlier this morning, I can only pray that history will prove my worst fears and deepest anxieties about the American future. I hope that they have proved excessive. I sincerely pray my nation, as increasingly multicultural and interracial and diverse as it is, will prove itself somehow incapable of spiraling down toward inhumanity and tyranny, and that those elected to leadership in the future will be wise stewards of America's highest ideals. Even as unwise leaders, dare we pray it, will be restrained by the checks and balances of countervailing democratic institutions, and that finally the worst politicians will fade away and be silenced. But if things do spin more out of control, and who amongst us can doubt the powers that are going on in this country that are not good. If things do spin out of control, I pray I will prove brave enough, courageous enough, faithful enough to stand up and give voice to my faith and truly fight for what I know is right and good. And this morning I pray for the same strength of heart for each and every one of you. May we together, in the days and years ahead, prove to be good and strong and brave and true Unitarian Universalists. And in the cauldron of life, the messy cauldron of life that is now America, may we never fail to stand up when it really matters and be counted in our neighborhoods and homes, our churches and schools, in the public square, in defense of what we believe deep to the heart. May we prove worthy of the name Unitarian Universalists and find the courage deep within us to defend what we know in the end must be defended. Amen.
Please rise in body or spirit and join in singing our closing hymn, number 287, Faith of the Larger Liberty.
Faith of the larger liberty, source of the light expanding, law of the church that is to be, rule bondage notwithstanding. Faith of the free, by thee we live, by all thou givest, and shalt give our loyalty commanding. Heroes of faith in every age, foreseeing self-denying, what an increasing heritage, monarch and creed defining. Faith of the free, in thy dear name, the costly heritage we claim, then living and then dying. Faith for the people everywhere, whatever their oppression, of all who make global warfare, living their faith's confession. Faith of the free, whatever plight, thy law, thy liberty, thy light shall be our best possession.
And I send you on your way with these words from my colleague Wayne Arnson. Take courage, friends. The way is often hard. The path is never clear, and the stakes are very high. Take courage, for deep down there is another truth. You are not alone. Amen.
I'd like to introduce and thank our first pop-up choir of the summer, so thank you all. And thank you to Jeff Lower for playing percussion and Phil Kancianic, our pianist today. We're going to sing a traditional spiritual, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Round, so please feel free to join in with us.
Thank you, that was awesome. And it would be a great way to close the service, but unfortunately we've got two more pieces of business. First is an announcement that I neglected to create space for this before the beginning of service from Linda Holloway. So Linda, please.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you, Reverend Scott, for that sermon. I want a copy of it for the time capsule. So I'm here to just repeat a long-held wish for us that you help fill our time capsule. It's barely beginning to be full. I brought my old buttons. One says support ERA. I have a Biden button and an Obama button, and Reverend Scott gave me some buttons, so those will go in there. These are our messages to our descendants in 2045. That's our 75th birthday of this church, and I don't think I'll be around for that, but I hope that we can leave them some amazing messages about how we are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. We invite our congregates attending worship on Zoom to use the chat box as a virtual receiving line to leave a message about your appreciation for the worship service. Please also stay and join us for our virtual Greet Your Neighbor coffee hour today to discuss the service theme and enjoy fellowship with other congregants. The link is in the chat box and will be on a forthcoming slide. Everybody here in person is invited to join us in the lobby and outside on the deck for coffee or tea and fellowship. A gentle reminder that we no longer stack the chairs after service, so please leave them as they are. That concludes our service. Thanks to each and every one of you for being with us here today.